Chapter 6 of The Professor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 6. I re-entered the town a hungry man. The dinner I had forgotten recurred seductively to my recollection, and it was with a quick step and sharp appetite I ascended the narrow street leading to my lodgings. It was dark when I opened the front door and walked into the house. I wondered how my fire would be. The night was cold, and I shuddered at the prospect of a grate full of sparkless cinders. To my joyful surprise, I found, on entering my sitting-room, a good fire and a clean hearth. I had hardly noticed this phenomenon when I became aware of another subject for wonderment. The chair I usually occupied near the hearth was already filled. A person sat there with his arms folded on his chest and his legs stretched out on the rug. Short-sighted as I am, doubtful as was the gleam of the firelight, a moment's examination enabled me to recognise in this person my acquaintance, Mr. Hunsden. I could not, of course, be much pleased to see him, considering the manner in which I had parted from him the night before, and as I walked to the hearth, stirred the fire, and said coolly, "Good evening," my demeanour evinced as little cordiality as I felt. Yet I wondered in my own mind what had brought him there, and I wondered also what motives had induced him to interfere so actively between me and Edward. It was to him, it appeared, that I owed my welcome dismissal. Still, I could not bring myself to ask him questions, to show any eagerness of curiosity. If he chose to explain, he might, but the explanation should be a perfectly voluntary one on his part. I thought he was entering upon it. "You owe me a debt of gratitude," were his first words. "Do I?" said I. "I hope it is not a large one, for I am much too poor to charge myself with heavy liabilities of any kind." "Then declare yourself bankrupt at once, for this liability is a ton weight at least. When I came in I found your fire out, and I had it lit again, and made that sulky drab of a servant stay and blow at it with the bellows till it had burnt up properly. Now say thank you. Not till I have had something to eat. I can thank nobody while I am so famished." I rang the bell and ordered tea and some cold meat. "Cold meat!" exclaimed Hunsden, as the servant closed the door. "What a glutton you are! Man, meat with tea! You'll die of eating too much." "No, Mr. Hunsden, I shall not." I felt a necessity for contradicting him. I was irritated with hunger, and irritated at seeing him there, and irritated at the continued roughness of his manner. "It is overeating that makes you so ill-tempered," said he. "How do you know?" I demanded. "It is like you to give a pragmatical opinion without being acquainted with any of the circumstances of the case. I have had no dinner." What I said was petulant and snappish enough, and Hunsden only replied by looking in my face and laughing. "Poor thing!" he whined after a pause. "It has had no dinner, has it? What, I suppose its master would not let it come home. Did Crimsworth order you to fast by way of punishment, William?" "No, Mr. Hunsden." Fortunately, at this sulky juncture, tea was brought in, and I fell to upon some bread and butter and cold beef directly. Having cleared a plateful, I became so far humanized as to intimate to Mr. Hunsden that he need not sit there staring, but might come to the table and do as I did, if he liked. "But I don't like in the least," said he, and therewith he summoned the servant by a fresh pull of the bell-rope, and intimated a desire to have a glass of toast and water. "And some more coal," he added. "Mr. Crimsworth shall keep a good fire while I stay." His orders being executed, he wheeled his chair round to the table, so as to be opposite me. "Well," he proceeded, "you are out of work, I suppose?" "Yes," said I. and not disposed to show the satisfaction I felt on this point, I, yielding to the whim of the moment, took up the subject as though I considered myself aggrieved rather than benefited by what had been done. "Yes, thanks to you, I am. Crimsworth turned me off at a minute's notice, owing to some interference of yours at a public meeting, I understand." "Ah, what? He mentioned that? He observed me signalling the lads, did he? What had he to say about his friend Hunsden? Anything sweet?" "He called you a treacherous villain." "Oh, he hardly knows me yet. I'm just one of those shy people who don't come out all at once, and he is only just beginning to make my acquaintance, but he'll find I've some good qualities, excellent ones. The Hunsdens were always unrivalled at tracking a rascal. A downright dishonourable villain is their natural prey. They could not keep off him wherever they met him. You used the word pragmatical just now. That word is the property of our family. It has been applied to us from generation to generation. We have fine noses for abuses. We scent a scoundrel a mile off. We are reformers born, radical reformers. And it was impossible for me to live in the same town with Crimsworth, to come into weekly contact with him, to witness some of his conduct to you, for whom personally I care nothing. I only consider the brutal injustice with which he violated your natural claim to equality. I say it was impossible for me to be thus situated, and not feel the angel or the demon of my race at work within me. I followed my instinct, opposed a tyrant, and broke a chain." Now this speech interested me much, both because it brought out Hunsden's character, and because it explained his motives. It interested me so much that I forgot to reply to it, and sat silent, pondering over a throng of ideas it had suggested. "Are you grateful to me?" he asked presently. In fact, I was grateful, or almost so, and I believe I half liked him at the moment, notwithstanding his proviso that what he had done was not out of regard for me. But human nature is perverse. Impossible to answer his blunt question in the affirmative, so I disclaimed all tendency to gratitude, and advised him, if he expected any reward for his championship, to look for it in a better world, as he was not likely to meet with it here. In reply, he termed me a dry-hearted aristocratic scamp, whereupon I again charged him with having taken the bread out of my mouth. "Your bread was dirty, man," cried Hunsden. "Dirty and unwholesome. It came through the hands of a tyrant, for I tell you Crimsworth is a tyrant to his work people, a tyrant to his clerks, and will some day be a tyrant to his wife." "Nonsense. Bread is bread, and a salary is a salary. I've lost mine, and through your means." "There's sense in what you say, after all," rejoined Hunsden. "I must say I am rather agreeably surprised to hear you make so practical an observation as that last. I had imagined now, from my previous observation of your character, that the sentimental delight you would have taken in your newly regained liberty would, for a while at least, have effaced all ideas of forethought and prudence. I think better of you for looking steadily to the needful." "Looking steadily to the needful? How can I do otherwise? I must live, and to live I must have what you call the needful, which I can only get by working. I repeat it, you have taken my work from me." "What do you mean to do?" pursued Hunsden coolly. "You have influential relations. I suppose they'll soon provide you with another place." "Influential relations? Who? I should like to know their names." "The Seacombes." "Stuff! I have cut them." Hunsden looked at me incredulously. "I have," said I, "and that definitively." "You must mean that they have cut you, William." "As you please. They offered me their patronage on condition of my entering the church. I declined both the terms and the recompense. I withdrew from my cold uncles, and preferred throwing myself into my elder brother's arms, from whose affectionate embrace I am now torn by the cruel intermeddling of a stranger, of yourself, in short." I could not repress a half-smile as I said this. A similar demi-manifestation of feeling appeared at the same moment on Hunsden's lips. "Oh, I see," said he, looking into my eyes, and it was evident he did see right down into my heart. Having sat a minute or two with his chin resting on his hand, diligently occupied in the continued perusal of my countenance, he went on: "Seriously, have you then nothing to expect from the Seacombes?" "Yes, rejection and repulsion. Why do you ask me twice? How can hands stained with the ink of a counting-house, soiled with the grease of a wool warehouse, ever again be permitted to come into contact with aristocratic palms?" "There would be a difficulty, no doubt. Still, you are such a complete Seacombe in appearance, feature, language, almost manner, I wonder they should disown you." "They have disowned me, so talk no more about it." "Do you regret it, William?" "No." "Why not, lad?" "Because they are not people with whom I could ever have had any sympathy." "I say you are one of them." "That merely proves that you know nothing at all about it. I am my mother's son, but not my uncle's nephew." "Still, one of your uncles is a lord, though rather an obscure and not a very wealthy one, and the other is a right honourable. You should consider worldly interest." "Nonsense, Mr. Hunsden. You may or may not know that even had I desired to be submissive to my uncles, I could not have stooped with a good enough grace ever to have won their favour. I should have sacrificed my own comfort, and not gained their patronage in return." "Very likely. So you calculated your wisest plan was to follow your own devices at once?" "Exactly. I must follow my own devices. I must, till the day of my death, because I can neither comprehend, adopt, nor work out those of other people." Hunsden yawned. "Well," said he, "in all this I see but one thing clearly, that is, that the whole affair is no business of mine." He stretched himself and again yawned. "I wonder what time it is," he went on. "I have an appointment for 7 o'clock." 6:15 by my watch. "Well, then I'll go." He got up. "You'll not meddle with trade again?" said he, leaning his elbow on the mantelpiece. "No, I think not." "You would be a fool if you did. Probably, after all, you'll think better of your uncle's proposal and go into the church." "A singular regeneration must take place in my whole inner and outer man before I do that. A good clergyman is one of the best of men." "Indeed, do you think so?" interrupted Hunsden scoffingly. "I do, and no mistake; but I have not the peculiar points which go to make a good clergyman, and rather than adopt a profession for which I have no vocation, I would endure extremities of hardship from poverty." "You're a mighty difficult customer to suit. You won't be a tradesman or a parson, you can't be a lawyer or a doctor or a gentleman, because you've no money. I'd recommend you to travel." "What, without money?" "You must travel in search of money, man. You can speak French, with a vile English accent, no doubt, still you can speak it. Go on to the continent, and see what will turn up for you there." "God knows I should like to go," exclaimed I with involuntary ardour. "Go! What the deuce hinders you? You may get to Brussels, for instance, for £5 or £6, if you know how to manage with economy." "Necessity would teach me if I didn't." "Go then, and let your wits make a way for you when you get there. I know Brussels almost as well as I know X, and I'm sure it would suit such a one as you better than London." "But occupation, Mr. Hunsden, I must go where occupation is to be had. And how could I get recommendation or introduction or employment at Brussels?" "There speaks the organ of caution. You hate to advance a step before you know every inch of the way. You haven't a sheet of paper and a pen and ink?" "I hope so." And I produced writing materials with alacrity, for I guessed what he was going to do. He sat down, wrote a few lines, folded, sealed, and addressed a letter, and held it out to me. "There, Prudence, there's a pioneer to hew down the first rough difficulties of your path. I know well enough, lad, you are not one of those who will run their neck into a noose without seeing how they are to get it out again, and you're right there. A reckless man is my aversion, and nothing should ever persuade me to meddle with the concerns of such a one. Those who are reckless for themselves are generally 10 times more so for their friends. This is a letter of introduction, I suppose, said I, taking the epistle. Yes. With that in your pocket, you will run no risk of finding yourself in a state of absolute destitution, which I know you will regard as a degradation. So should I, for that matter. The person to whom you will present it generally has 2 or 3 respectable places, depending upon his recommendation. That will just suit me, said I. Well, and where's your gratitude? Demanded Mr. Hunsden. Don't you know when to say thank you? I've £15 and a watch, which my godmother, whom I never saw, gave me 18 years ago, was my rather irrelevant answer, and I further avowed myself a happy man, and professed that I did not envy any being in Christendom. But your gratitude? I shall be off presently, Mr. Hunsden. Tomorrow, if all be well. I'll not stay a day longer in X than I'm obliged. Very good, but it will be decent to make due acknowledgment for the assistance you have received. Be quick. It is just going to strike 7. I'm waiting to be thanked. Just stand out of the way, will you, Mr. Hunsden? I want a key there is on the corner of the mantelpiece. I'll pack my portmanteau before I go to bed. The house clock struck 7. The lad is a heathen, said Hunsden, and taking his hat from a sideboard, he left the room, laughing to himself. I had half an inclination to follow him. I really intended to leave X the next morning, and should certainly not have another opportunity of bidding him good-bye. The front door banged to. Let him go, said I. We shall meet again some day. End of chapter 6. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.
The Professor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippa. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 7. Reader, perhaps you were never in Belgium. Haply you don't know the physiognomy of the country. You have not its lineaments defined upon your memory, as I have them on mine. 3, nay 4 pictures line the four-walled cell where are stored for me the records of the past. First, Eton. All in that picture is in far perspective, receding, diminutive, but freshly coloured, green, dewy, with the spring sky piled with glittering yet showery clouds. For my childhood was not all sunshine. It had its overcast, its cold, its stormy hours. Second, X. Huge, dingy, the canvas cracked and smoked, a yellow sky, sooty clouds, no sun, no azure, the verdure of the suburbs blighted and sullied, a very dreary scene. Third, Belgium. And I will pause before this landscape. As to the fourth, a curtain covers it, which I may hereafter withdraw, or may not, as suits my convenience and capacity. At any rate, for the present, it must hang undisturbed. Belgium. Name unromantic and unpoetic, yet name that whenever uttered has in my ear a sound, in my heart an echo, such as no other assemblage of syllables, however sweet or classic, can produce. Belgium. I repeat the word now as I sit alone near midnight. It stirs my world of the past like a summons to resurrection. The grave is unclosed, the dead are raised, thoughts, feelings, memories that slept are seen by me ascending from the clouds, haloed most of them. But while I gaze on their vapoury forms, and strive to ascertain definitely their outline, the sound which wakened them dies, and they sink, each and all, like a light wreath of mist, absorbed in the mould, recalled to urns, resealed in monuments. Farewell, luminous phantoms. This is Belgium, reader. Look, don't call the picture a flat or a dull one. It was neither flat nor dull to me when I first beheld it. When I left Ostend on a mild February morning, and found myself on the road to Brussels, nothing could look vapid to me. My sense of enjoyment possessed an edge whetted to the finest, untouched, keen, exquisite. I was young, I had good health, pleasure and I had never met, no indulgence of hers had enervated or sated one faculty of my nature. Liberty I clasped in my arms for the first time, and the influence of her smile and embrace revived my life like the sun and the west wind. Yes, at that epoch I felt like a morning traveller, who doubts not that from the hill he is ascending he shall behold a glorious sunrise. What if the track be straight, steep, and stony? He sees it not. His eyes are fixed on that summit, flushed already, flushed and gilded, and having gained it, he is certain of the scene beyond. He knows that the sun will face him, that his chariot is even now coming over the eastern horizon, and that the herald breeze he feels on his cheek is opening for the god's career a clear, vast path of azure, amidst clouds soft as pearl and warm as flame. Difficulty and toil were to be my lot, but sustained by energy, drawn on by hopes as bright as vague, I deemed such a lot no hardship. I mounted now the hill in shade. There were pebbles, inequalities, briars in my path, but my eyes were fixed on the crimson peak above, my imagination was with the refulgent firmament beyond, and I thought nothing of the stones turning under my feet, or of the thorns scratching my face and hands. I gazed often, and always with delight, from the windows of the diligence. These, be it remembered, were not the days of trains and railroads. Well, and what did I see? I will tell you faithfully. Green, reedy swamps, fields fertile but flat, cultivated in patches that made them look like magnified kitchen gardens, belts of cut trees, formal as pollard willows, skirting the horizon, narrow canals gliding slow by the roadside, painted Flemish farmhouses, some very dirty hovels, a grey dead sky, wet road, wet fields, wet housetops. Not a beautiful, scarcely a picturesque object met my eye along the whole route. Yet to me all was beautiful, all was more than picturesque. It continued fair so long as daylight lasted, though the moisture of many preceding damp days had sodden the whole country. As it grew dark, however, the rain recommenced, and it was through streaming and starless darkness my eye caught the first gleam of the lights of Brussels. I saw little of the city but its lights that night. Having alighted from the diligence, a fiacre conveyed me to the Hôtel de , where I had been advised by a fellow traveller to put up. Having eaten a traveller's supper, I retired to bed, and slept a traveller's sleep. Next morning I awoke from prolonged and sound repose with the impression that I was yet in X, and, perceiving it to be broad daylight, I started up, imagining that I had overslept myself, and should be behind time at the counting-house. The momentary and painful sense of restraint vanished before the revived and reviving consciousness of freedom, as, throwing back the white curtains of my bed, I looked forth into a wide, lofty, foreign chamber. How different from the small and dingy, though not uncomfortable, apartment I had occupied for a night or two at a respectable inn in London, while waiting for the sailing of the packet. Yet far be it from me to profane the memory of that little dingy room. It, too, is dear to my soul. For there, as I lay in quiet and darkness, I first heard the great bell of St. Paul's telling London it was midnight, and well do I recall the deep, deliberate tones, so full charged with colossal phlegm and force. From the small narrow window of that room I first saw the dome looming through a London mist. I suppose the sensations stirred by those first sounds, first sights, are felt but once. Treasure them, memory, seal them in urns and keep them in safe niches. Well, I rose. Travellers talk of the apartments in foreign dwellings being bare and uncomfortable. I thought my chamber looked stately and cheerful. It had such large windows, croisées that opened like doors, with such broad, clear panes of glass, such a great looking-glass stood on my dressing-table, such a fine mirror glittered over the mantelpiece, the painted floor looked so clean and glossy. When I had dressed and was descending the stairs, the broad marble steps almost awed me, and so did the lofty hall into which they conducted. On the first landing I met a Flemish housemaid. She had wooden shoes, a short red petticoat, a printed cotton bedgown. Her face was broad, her physiognomy eminently stupid. When I spoke to her in French, she answered me in Flemish, with an air the reverse of civil, yet I thought her charming. If she was not pretty or polite, she was, I conceived, very picturesque. She reminded me of the female figures in certain Dutch paintings I had seen in other years at Seacombe Hall. I repaired to the public room. That too was very large and very lofty, and warmed by a stove. The floor was black, and the stove was black, and most of the furniture was black, yet I never experienced a freer sense of exhilaration than when I sat down at a very long black table, covered however in part by a white cloth, and having ordered breakfast, began to pour out my coffee from a little black coffee-pot. The stove might be dismal looking to some eyes, not to mine, but it was indisputably very warm, and there were two gentlemen seated by it talking in French. Impossible to follow their rapid utterance or comprehend much of the purport of what they said. Yet French, in the mouths of Frenchmen, or Belgians, I was not then sensible of the horrors of the Belgian accent, was as music to my ears. One of these gentlemen presently discerned me to be an Englishman, no doubt from the fashion in which I addressed the waiter, for I would persist in speaking French in my execrable South of England style, though the man understood English. The gentleman, after looking towards me once or twice, politely accosted me in very good English. I remember I wished to God that I could speak French as well. His fluency and correct pronunciation impressed me for the first time with a due notion of the cosmopolitan character of the capital I was in. It was my first experience of that skill in living languages I afterwards found to be so general in Brussels. I lingered over my breakfast as long as I could. While it was there on the table, and while that stranger continued talking to me, I was a free, independent traveller. But at last the things were removed, the two gentlemen left the room. Suddenly the illusion ceased, reality and business came back. I, a bondsman just released from the yoke, freed for 1 week from 21 years of constraint, must of necessity resume the fetters of dependency. Hardly had I tasted the delight of being without a master, when duty issued her stern mandate, "Go forth and seek another service." I never linger over a painful and necessary task. I never take pleasure before business. It is not in my nature to do so. Impossible to enjoy a leisurely walk over the city, though I perceived the morning was very fine, until I had first presented Mr. Hunsden's letter of introduction, and got fairly on to the track of a new situation. Wrenching my mind from liberty and delight, I seized my hat, and forced my reluctant body out of the Hôtel de into the foreign street. It was a fine day, but I would not look at the blue sky or at the stately houses around me. My mind was bent on one thing, finding out Mr. Brown, numero Rue Royale, for so my letter was addressed. By dint of inquiry I succeeded. I stood at last at the desired door, knocked, asked for Mr. Brown, and was admitted. Being shown into a small breakfast room, I found myself in the presence of an elderly gentleman, very grave, businesslike, and respectable looking. I presented Mr. Hunsden's letter. He received me very civilly. After a little desultory conversation, he asked me if there was anything in which his advice or experience could be of use. I said yes, and then proceeded to tell him that I was not a gentleman of fortune, travelling for pleasure, but an ex-counting-house clerk, who wanted employment of some kind, and that immediately too. He replied that as a friend of Mr. Hunsden's he would be willing to assist me as well as he could. After some meditation he named a place in a mercantile house at Liège, and another in a bookseller's shop at Louvain. Clerk and shopman, murmured I to myself. No, I shook my head. I had tried the high stool. I hated it. I believed there were other occupations that would suit me better. Besides, I did not wish to leave Brussels. I know of no place in Brussels, answered Mr. Brown, unless indeed you were disposed to turn your attention to teaching. I am acquainted with the director of a large establishment who is in want of a professor of English and Latin. I thought 2 minutes, then I seized the idea eagerly. The very thing, sir, said I. But, asked he, do you understand French well enough to teach Belgian boys English? Fortunately, I could answer this question in the affirmative. Having studied French under a Frenchman, I could speak the language intelligibly, though not fluently. I could also read it well and write it decently. Then, pursued Mr. Brown, I think I can promise you the place, for Monsieur Pelet will not refuse a professor recommended by me, but come here again at 5 o'clock this afternoon, and I will introduce you to him. The word professor struck me. I am not a professor, said I. Oh, returned Mr. Brown, professor here in Belgium means a teacher, that is all. My conscience thus quieted, I thanked Mr. Brown, and, for the present, withdrew. This time I stepped out into the street with a relieved heart. The task I had imposed on myself for that day was executed. For the first time I remarked the sparkling clearness of the air, the deep blue of the sky, the gay, clean aspect of the whitewashed or painted houses. I saw what a fine street was the Rue Royale, and walking leisurely along its broad pavement, I continued to survey its stately hotels, till the palisades, the gates, and trees of the park appearing in sight, offered to my eye a new attraction. I remember, before entering the park, I stood a while to contemplate the statue of General Belliard, and then I advanced to the top of the great staircase just beyond, and I looked down into a narrow back street, which I afterwards learnt was called the Rue d'Isabelle. I well recollect that my eye rested on the green door of a rather large house opposite, where on a brass plate was inscribed Pensionnat de Demoiselles. Pensionnat. The word excited an uneasy sensation in my mind. It seemed to speak of restraint. Some of the demoiselles, externats no doubt, were at that moment issuing from the door. I looked for a pretty face amongst them, but their close little French bonnets hid their features. In a moment they were gone. I had traversed a good deal of Brussels before 5 o'clock arrived, but punctually as that hour struck, I was again in the Rue Royale. Readmitted to Mr. Brown's breakfast-room, I found him, as before, seated at the table, and he was not alone. A gentleman stood by the hearth. 2 words of introduction designated him as my future master. Monsieur Pelet, Mr. Crimsworth. Mr. Crimsworth, Monsieur Pelet. A bow on each side finished the ceremony. I don't know what sort of a bow I made, an ordinary one, I suppose, for I was in a tranquil, commonplace frame of mind. I felt none of the agitation which had troubled my first interview with Edward Crimsworth. Monsieur Pelet's bow was extremely polite, yet not theatrical, scarcely French. He and I were presently seated opposite to each other. In a pleasing voice, low, and, out of consideration to my foreign ears, very distinct and deliberate, Monsieur Pelet intimated that he had just been receiving from le respectable Monsieur Brown an account of my attainments and character, which relieved him from all scruple as to the propriety of engaging me as professor of English and Latin in his establishment. Nevertheless, for form's sake, he would put a few questions to test my powers. He did, and expressed in flattering terms his satisfaction at my answers. The subject of salary next came on. It was fixed at 1,000 francs per annum, besides board and lodging. And in addition, suggested M. Pelet, as there will be some hours in each day during which your services will not be required in my establishment, you may in time obtain employment in other seminaries, and thus turn your vacant moments to profitable account. I thought this very kind, and indeed I found afterwards that the terms on which M. Pelet had engaged me were really liberal for Brussels, instruction being extremely cheap there, on account of the number of teachers. It was further arranged that I should be installed in my new post the very next day, after which M. Pelet and I parted. Well, and what was he like? And what were my impressions concerning him? He was a man of about 40 years of age, of middle size and rather emaciated figure. His face was pale, his cheeks were sunk, and his eyes hollow. His features were pleasing and regular. They had a French turn, for M. Pelet was no Fleming, but a Frenchman, both by birth and parentage. Yet the degree of harshness inseparable from Gallic lineaments was in his case softened by a mild blue eye, and a melancholy, almost suffering expression of countenance. His physiognomy was fine et spirituelle. I use two French words, because they define better than any English terms the species of intelligence with which his features were imbued. He was altogether an interesting and prepossessing personage. I wondered only at the utter absence of all the ordinary characteristics of his profession, and almost feared he could not be stern and resolute enough for a schoolmaster. Externally, at least, M. Pelet presented an absolute contrast to my late master, Edward Crimsworth. Influenced by the impression I had received of his gentleness, I was a good deal surprised when, on arriving the next day at my new employer's house, and being admitted to a first view of what was to be the sphere of my future labours, namely the large, lofty, and well-lighted schoolrooms, I beheld a numerous assemblage of pupils, boys of course, whose collective appearance showed all the signs of a full, flourishing, and well-disciplined seminary. As I traversed the classes in company with M. Pelet, a profound silence reigned on all sides, and if by chance a murmur or a whisper arose, one glance from the pensive eye of this most gentle pedagogue stilled it instantly. It was astonishing, I thought, how so mild a check could prove so effectual. When I had perambulated the length and breadth of the classes, M. Pelet turned and said to me, "Would you object to taking the boys as they are, and testing their proficiency in English?" The proposal was unexpected. I had thought I should have been allowed at least 3 days to prepare, but it is a bad omen to commence any career by hesitation, so I just stepped to the professor's desk near which we stood, and faced the circle of my pupils. I took a moment to collect my thoughts, and likewise to frame in French the sentence by which I proposed to open business. I made it as short as possible. "Messieurs, prenez vos livres de lecture." "Anglais, français, monsieur?" demanded a thick-set, moon-faced young Flamand in a blouse. The answer was fortunately easy. "Anglais." I determined to give myself as little trouble as possible in this lesson. It would not do yet to trust my unpractised tongue with the delivery of explanations. My accent and idiom would be too open to the criticisms of the young gentleman before me, relative to whom I felt already it would be necessary at once to take up an advantageous position, and I proceeded to employ means accordingly. "Commencez," cried I, when they had all produced their books. The moon-faced youth, by name Jules Van de Kerkhoff, as I afterwards learnt, took the first sentence. The livre de lecture was the Vicar of Wakefield, much used in foreign schools because it is supposed to contain prime samples of conversational English. It might, however, have been a runic scroll for any resemblance the words, as enunciated by Jules, bore to the language in ordinary use among the natives of Great Britain. My God, how he did snuffle, snort, and wheeze! All he said was said in his throat and nose, for it is thus the Flamands speak, but I heard him to the end of his paragraph without proffering a word of correction, whereat he looked vastly self-complacent, convinced, no doubt, that he had acquitted himself like a real born and bred Anglais. In the same unmoved silence I listened to a dozen in rotation, and when the 12th had concluded, with splutter, hiss, and mumble, I solemnly laid down the book. "Arrêtez," said I. There was a pause, during which I regarded them all with a steady and somewhat stern gaze. A dog, if stared at hard enough and long enough, will show symptoms of embarrassment, and so at length did my bench of Belgians. Perceiving that some of the faces before me were beginning to look sullen, and others ashamed, I slowly joined my hands and ejaculated in a deep voix de poitrine, "Comme c'est affreux!" They looked at each other, pouted, coloured, swung their heels. They were not pleased, I saw, but they were impressed, and in the way I wished them to be. Having thus taken them down a peg in their self-conceit, the next step was to raise myself in their estimation, not a very easy thing, considering that I hardly dared to speak for fear of betraying my own deficiencies. "Écoutez, monsieur," said I, and I endeavoured to throw into my accents the compassionate tone of a superior being, who, touched by the extremity of the helplessness which at first only excited his scorn, deigns at length to bestow aid. I then began at the very beginning of the Vicar of Wakefield, and read in a slow, distinct voice some 20 pages, they all the while sitting mute and listening with fixed attention. By the time I had done, nearly an hour had elapsed. I then rose and said, "C'est assez pour aujourd'hui, monsieur. Demain nous recommencerons, et j'espère que tout ira bien." With this oracular sentence I bowed, and in company with Monsieur Pelet quitted the schoolroom. "C'est bien, c'est très bien," said my principal, as we entered his parlour. "Je vois que monsieur a de l'adresse. Cela me plaît, car dans l'instruction, l'adresse fait tout autant que le savoir." From the parlour, Monsieur Pelet conducted me to my apartment, my chambre, as Monsieur said, with a certain air of complacency. It was a very small room, with an excessively small bed, but Monsieur Pelet gave me to understand that I was to occupy it quite alone, which was of course a great comfort. Yet, though so limited in dimensions, it had 2 windows. Light not being taxed in Belgium, the people never grudge its admission into their houses. Just here, however, this observation is not very apropos, for one of these windows was boarded up. The open windows looked into the boys' playground. I glanced at the other, as wondering what aspect it would present if disencumbered of the boards. Monsieur Pelet read, I suppose, the expression of my eye. He explained. "La fenêtre fermée donne sur un jardin appartenant à un pensionnat de demoiselles," said he, "et les convenances exigent, enfin, vous comprenez, n'est-ce pas, monsieur?" "Oui, oui," was my reply, and I looked, of course, quite satisfied. But when Monsieur Pelet had retired and closed the door after him, the first thing I did was to scrutinize closely the nailed boards, hoping to find some chink or crevice which I might enlarge, and so get a peep at the consecrated ground. My researches were in vain, for the boards were well joined and strongly nailed. It is astonishing how disappointed I felt. I thought it would have been so pleasant to have looked out upon a garden planted with flowers and trees, so amusing to have watched the demoiselles at their play, to have studied female character in a variety of phases, myself the while sheltered from view by a modest muslin curtain, whereas, owing doubtless to the absurd scruples of some old duenna of a directress, I had now only the option of looking at a bare gravelled court, with an enormous pas de géant in the middle, and the monotonous walls and windows of a boys' schoolhouse round them. Not only then, but many a time after, especially in moments of weariness and low spirits, did I look with dissatisfied eyes on that most tantalizing board, longing to tear it away and get a glimpse of the green region which I imagined to lie beyond. I knew a tree grew close up to the window, for though there were as yet no leaves to rustle, I often heard at night the tapping of the branches against the panes. In the daytime, when I listened attentively, I could hear, even through the boards, the voices of the demoiselles in their hours of recreation, and, to speak the honest truth, my sentimental reflections were occasionally a trifle disarranged by the not quite silvery, in fact the too often brazen sounds, which, rising from the unseen paradise below, penetrated clamorously into my solitude. Not to mince matters, it really seemed to me a doubtful case whether the lungs of Mademoiselle Reuter's girls or those of Monsieur Pelet's boys were the strongest, and when it came to shrieking, the girls indisputably beat the boys hollow. I forgot to say, by the way, that Reuter was the name of the old lady who had had my window boarded up. I say old, for such I, of course, concluded her to be, judging from her cautious, chaperone-like proceedings. Besides, nobody ever spoke of her as young. I remember I was very much amused when I first heard her Christian name. It was Zoraide, Mademoiselle Zoraide Reuter. But the continental nations do allow themselves vagaries in the choice of names, such as we sober English never run to. I think, indeed, we have too limited a list to choose from. Meanwhile, my path was gradually growing smooth before me. I, in a few weeks, conquered the teasing difficulties inseparable from the commencement of almost every career. Ere long I had acquired as much facility in speaking French as set me at my ease with my pupils, and as I had encountered them on a right footing at the very beginning, and continued tenaciously to retain the advantage I had early gained, they never attempted mutiny, which circumstance all who are in any degree acquainted with the ongoings of Belgian schools, and who know the relation in which professors and pupils too frequently stand towards each other in those establishments, will consider an important and uncommon one. Before concluding this chapter, I will say a word on the system I pursued with regard to my classes. My experience may possibly be of use to others. It did not require very keen observation to detect the character of the youth of Brabant, but it needed a certain degree of tact to adapt one's measures to their capacity. Their intellectual faculties were generally weak, their animal propensities strong. Thus there was at once an impotence and a kind of inert force in their natures. They were dull, but they were also singularly stubborn, heavy as lead, and, like lead, most difficult to move. Such being the case, it would have been truly absurd to exact from them much in the way of mental exertion. Having short memories, dense intelligence, feeble reflective powers, they recoiled with repugnance from any occupation that demanded close study or deep thought. Had the abhorred effort been extorted from them by injudicious and arbitrary measures on the part of the professor, they would have resisted as obstinately, as clamorously, as desperate swine, and though not brave singly, they were relentless acting en masse. I understood that before my arrival in M. Pelet's establishment, the combined insubordination of the pupils had effected the dismissal of more than one English master. It was necessary then to exact only the most moderate application from natures so little qualified to apply, to assist in every practicable way understandings so opaque and contracted, to be ever gentle, considerate, yielding even to a certain point, with dispositions so irrationally perverse. But having reached that culminating point of indulgence, you must fix your foot, plant it, root it in rock, become immutable as the towers of Saint Gudule, for a step, but half a step farther, and you would plunge headlong into the gulf of imbecility. There lodged, you would speedily receive proofs of Flemish gratitude and magnanimity in showers of Brabant saliva and handfuls of low country mud. You might smooth to the utmost the path of learning, remove every pebble from the track, but then you must finally insist with decision on the pupil taking your arm and allowing himself to be led quietly along the prepared road. When I had brought down my lesson to the lowest level of my dullest pupil's capacity, when I had shown myself the mildest, the most tolerant of masters, a word of impertinence, a movement of disobedience, changed me at once into a despot. I offered them but one alternative, submission and acknowledgment of error, or ignominious expulsion. This system answered, and my influence by degrees became established on a firm basis. The boy is father to the man, it is said, and so I often thought when I looked at my boys and remembered the political history of their ancestors. Pelet's school was merely an epitome of the Belgian nation. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Professor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippa. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 8. And Pelet himself? How did I continue to like him? Oh, extremely well. Nothing could be more smooth, gentlemanlike, and even friendly than his demeanour to me. I had to endure from him neither cold neglect, irritating interference, nor pretentious assumption of superiority. I fear, however, 2 poor, hard-worked Belgian ushers in the establishment could not have said as much. To them the director's manner was invariably dry, stern, and cool. I believe he perceived once or twice that I was a little shocked at the difference he made between them and me, and accounted for it by saying, with a quiet, sarcastic smile, "Ce ne sont que des Flamands, allez!" And then he took his cigar gently from his lips and spat on the painted floor of the room in which we were sitting. Flamands certainly they were, and both had the true Flamand physiognomy, where intellectual inferiority is marked in lines none can mistake. Still they were men, and, in the main, honest men, and I could not see why their being aboriginals of the flat, dull soil should serve as a pretext for treating them with perpetual severity and contempt. This idea of injustice somewhat poisoned the pleasure I might otherwise have derived from Pelet's soft, affable manner to myself. Certainly it was agreeable, when the day's work was over, to find one's employer an intelligent and cheerful companion, and if he was sometimes a little sarcastic, and sometimes a little too insinuating, and if I did discover that his mildness was more a matter of appearance than of reality, if I did occasionally suspect the existence of flint or steel under an external covering of velvet, still we are none of us perfect, and weary as I was of the atmosphere of brutality and insolence in which I had constantly lived at X, I had no inclination now, on casting anchor in calmer regions, to institute at once a prying search after defects that were scrupulously withdrawn and carefully veiled from my view. I was willing to take Pelet for what he seemed, to believe him benevolent and friendly until some untoward event should prove him otherwise. He was not married, and I soon perceived he had all a Frenchman's, all a Parisian's notions about matrimony and women. I suspected a degree of laxity in his code of morals. There was something so cold and blasé in his tone whenever he alluded to what he called le beau sexe, but he was too gentlemanlike to intrude topics I did not invite, and as he was really intelligent and really fond of intellectual subjects of discourse, he and I always found enough to talk about without seeking themes in the mire. I hated his fashion of mentioning love. I abhorred from my soul mere licentiousness. He felt the difference of our notions, and by mutual consent we kept off ground debatable. Pelet's house was kept, and his kitchen managed, by his mother, a real old Frenchwoman. She had been handsome, at least she told me so, and I strove to believe her. She was now ugly, as only continental old women can be. Perhaps, though, her style of dress made her look uglier than she really was. Indoors she would go about without cap, her grey hair strangely dishevelled. Then, when at home, she seldom wore a gown, only a shabby cotton camisole. Shoes, too, were strangers to her feet, and in lieu of them she sported roomy slippers trodden down at the heels. On the other hand, whenever it was her pleasure to appear abroad, as on Sundays and fête days, she would put on some very brilliant coloured dress, usually of thin texture, a silk bonnet with a wreath of flowers, and a very fine shawl. She was not in the main an ill-natured old woman, but an incessant and most indiscreet talker. She kept chiefly in and about the kitchen, and seemed rather to avoid her son's august presence. Of him, indeed, she evidently stood in awe. When he reproved her, his reproofs were bitter and unsparing, but he seldom gave himself that trouble. Madame Pelet had her own society, her own circle of chosen visitors, whom, however, I seldom saw, as she generally entertained them in what she called her cabinet, a small den of a place adjoining the kitchen, and descending into it by 1 or 2 steps. On these steps, by the by, I have not unfrequently seen Madame Pelet seated, with a trencher on her knee, engaged in the threefold employment of eating her dinner, gossiping with her favourite servant, the housemaid, and scolding her antagonist, the cook. She never dined, and seldom indeed took any meal, with her son, and as to showing her face at the boys' table, that was quite out of the question. These details will sound very odd in English ears, but Belgium is not England, and its ways are not our ways. Madame Pelet's habits of life, then, being taken into consideration, I was a good deal surprised when one Thursday evening (Thursday was always a half holiday), as I was sitting all alone in my apartment, correcting a huge pile of English and Latin exercises, a servant tapped at the door, and, on its being opened, presented Madame Pelet's compliments, and she would be happy to see me to take my goûter, a meal which answers to our English tea, with her in the dining-room. Plaît-il? Said I, for I thought I must have misunderstood, the message and invitation were so unusual. The same words were repeated. I accepted, of course, and as I descended the stairs, I wondered what whim had entered the old lady's brain. Her son was out, gone to pass the evening at the salle of the Grande Harmonie, or some other club of which he was a member. Just as I laid my hand on the handle of the dining-room door, a queer idea glanced across my mind. "Surely she's not going to make love to me," said I. "I've heard of old Frenchwomen doing odd things in that line. And the goûter, they generally begin such affairs with eating and drinking, I believe." There was a fearful dismay in this suggestion of my excited imagination, and if I had allowed myself time to dwell upon it, I should no doubt have cut there and then, rushed back to my chamber, and bolted myself in. But whenever a danger or a horror is unveiled with uncertainty, the primary wish of the mind is to ascertain first the naked truth, reserving the expedient of flight for the moment when its dread anticipation shall be realized. I turned the door handle, and in an instant had crossed the fatal threshold, closed the door behind me, and stood in the presence of Madame Pelet. Gracious heavens! The first view of her seemed to confirm my worst apprehensions. There she sat, dressed out in a light green muslin gown, on her head a lace cap with flourishing red roses in the frill. Her table was carefully spread. There were fruit, cakes, and coffee, with a bottle of something, I did not know what. Already the cold sweat started on my brow, already I glanced back over my shoulder at the closed door, when, to my unspeakable relief, my eye, wandering mildly in the direction of the stove, rested upon a second figure, seated in a large fauteuil beside it. This was a woman too, and moreover an old woman, and as fat and as rubicund as Madame Pelet was meagre and yellow. Her attire was likewise very fine, and spring flowers of different hues circled in a bright wreath the crown of her violet-coloured velvet bonnet. I had only time to make these general observations, when Madame Pelet, coming forward with what she intended should be a graceful and elastic step, thus accosted me: "Monsieur is indeed most obliging to quit his books, his studies, at the request of an insignificant person like me. Will Monsieur complete his kindness by allowing me to present him to my dear friend Madame Reuter, who resides in the neighbouring house, the young ladies' school?" Ah, thought I knew she was old. And I bowed and took my seat. Madame Reuter placed herself at the table opposite to me. "How do you like Belgium, monsieur?" asked she, in an accent of the broadest Bruxellois. I could now well distinguish the difference between the fine and pure Parisian utterance of M. Pelet, for instance, and the guttural enunciation of the Flamands. I answered politely, and then wondered how so coarse and clumsy an old woman as the one before me should be at the head of a ladies' seminary, which I had always heard spoken of in terms of high commendation. In truth, there was something to wonder at. Madame Reuter looked more like a joyous, free-living old Flemish fermier, or even a maîtresse d'auberge, than a staid, grave, rigid directrice de pensionnat. In general, the continental, or at least the Belgian old women, permit themselves a license of manners, speech, and aspect, such as our venerable grandes dames would recoil from as absolutely disreputable, and Madame Reuter's jolly face bore evidence that she was no exception to the rule of her country. There was a twinkle and leer in her left eye; her right she kept habitually half shut, which I thought very odd indeed. After several vain attempts to comprehend the motives of these two droll old creatures for inviting me to join them at their goûter, I at last fairly gave it up, and resigning myself to inevitable mystification, I sat and looked first at one, then at the other, taking care meantime to do justice to the confitures, cakes, and coffee with which they amply supplied me. They too ate, and that with no delicate appetite, and having demolished a large portion of the solids, they proposed a petit verre. I declined. Not so Mesdames Pelet and Reuter. Each mixed herself what I thought rather a stiff tumbler of punch, and placing it on a stand near the stove, they drew up their chairs to that convenience, and invited me to do the same. I obeyed, and being seated fairly between them, I was thus addressed first by Madame Pelet, then by Madame Reuter. "We will now speak of business," said Madame Pelet, and she went on to make an elaborate speech, which, being interpreted, was to the effect that she had asked for the pleasure of my company that evening, in order to give her friend Madame Reuter an opportunity of broaching an important proposal, which might turn out greatly to my advantage. "Pourvu que vous soyez sage," said Madame Reuter, "et à vrai dire, vous en avez bien l'air, take one drop of the punch," or punch, as she pronounced it. "It is an agreeable and wholesome beverage after a full meal." I bowed, but again declined it. She went on. "I feel," said she, after a solemn sip, "I feel profoundly the importance of the commission with which my dear daughter has entrusted me, for you are aware, monsieur, that it is my daughter who directs the establishment in the next house." "Ah, I thought it was yourself, madame." Though, indeed, at that moment I recollected that it was called Mademoiselle, not Madame Reuter's pensionnat. "I? Oh, no. I manage the house and look after the servants, as my friend Madame Pelet does for monsieur her son. Nothing more. Ah, you thought I gave lessons in class, did you?" And she laughed loud and long, as though the idea tickled her fancy amazingly. "Madame is in the wrong to laugh," I observed. "If she does not give lessons, I am sure it is not because she cannot." And I whipped out a white pocket handkerchief and wafted it with a French grace past my nose, bowing at the same time. "Quel charmant jeune homme!" murmured Madame Pelet in a low voice. Madame Reuter, being less sentimental, as she was Flamand and not French, only laughed again. "You are a dangerous person, I fear," said she. "If you can forge compliments at that rate, Zoraide will positively be afraid of you. But, if you're good, I will keep your secret and not tell her how well you can flatter. Now, listen to what sort of a proposal she makes to you. She has heard that you are an excellent professor, and as she wishes to get the very best masters for her school, car Zoraide fait tout comme une reine, c'est une véritable maîtresse femme, she has commissioned me to step over this afternoon and sound Madame Pelet as to the possibility of engaging you. Zoraide is a wary general. She never advances without first examining well her ground. I don't think she would be pleased if she knew I had already disclosed her intentions to you. She did not order me to go so far, but I thought there would be no harm in letting you into the secret, and Madame Pelet was of the same opinion. Take care, however, you don't betray either of us to Zoraide, to my daughter, I mean. She is so discreet and circumspect herself. She cannot understand that one should find a pleasure in gossiping a little. Ah, c'est absolument comme mon fils, cried Madame Pelet. All the world is changed since our girlhood, rejoined the other. Young people have such old heads now. But to return, monsieur. Madame Pelet will mention the subject of your giving lessons in my daughter's establishment to her son, and he will speak to you. And then tomorrow you will step over to our house and ask to see my daughter. And you will introduce the subject as if the first intimation of it had reached you from Monsieur Pelet himself. And be sure you never mention my name, for I would not displease Zoraide on any account. Bien, bien, interrupted I, for all this chatter and circumlocution began to bore me very much. I will consult Monsieur Pelet, and the thing shall be settled as you desire. Good evening, mesdames. I am infinitely obliged to you. Comment? Vous vous en allez déjà? Exclaimed Madame Pelet. Prenez encore quelque chose, monsieur. Une pomme cuite, des biscuits, encore une tasse de café. Merci, madame. Au revoir. And I backed at last out of the apartment. Having regained my own room, I set myself to turn over in my mind the incident of the evening. It seemed a queer affair altogether, and queerly managed. The two old women had made quite a little intricate mess of it. Still I found that the uppermost feeling in my mind on the subject was one of satisfaction. In the first place, it would be a change to give lessons in another seminary, and then to teach young ladies would be an occupation so interesting. To be admitted at all into a ladies' boarding school would be an incident so new in my life. Besides, thought I, as I glanced at the boarded window, I shall now at last see the mysterious garden. I shall gaze both on the angels and their Eden. End of chapter 8.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barony. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 9. Monsieur Pelet could not, of course, object to the proposal made by Mademoiselle Reuter. Permission to accept such additional employment, should it offer, having formed an article of the terms on which he had engaged me. It was, therefore, arranged in the course of next day that I should be at liberty to give lessons in Mademoiselle Reuter's establishment 4 afternoons in every week. When evening came, I prepared to step over in order to seek a conference with Mademoiselle herself on the subject. I had not had time to pay the visit before, having been all day closely occupied in class. I remember very well that before quitting my chamber I held a brief debate with myself as to whether I should change my ordinary attire for something smarter. At last I concluded it would be a waste of labour. Doubtless, thought I, she is some stiff old maid, for though the daughter of Madame Reuter, she may well number upwards of 40 winters. Besides, if it were otherwise, if she be both young and pretty, I am not handsome, and no dressing can make me so, therefore I'll go as I am. And off I started, cursorily glancing sideways as I passed the toilet table, surmounted by a looking-glass. A thin, irregular face I saw, with sunk dark eyes under a large square forehead, complexion destitute of bloom or attraction, something young but not youthful, no object to win a lady's love, no butt for the shafts of Cupid. I was soon at the entrance of the pensionnat. In a moment I had pulled the bell. In another moment the door was opened, and within appeared a passage paved alternately with black and white marble. The walls were painted in imitation of marble also, and at the far end opened a glass door, through which I saw shrubs and a grass plot, looking pleasant in the sunshine of the mild spring evening, for it was now the middle of April. This then was my first glimpse of the garden, but I had not time to look long. The portress, after having answered in the affirmative my question as to whether her mistress was at home, opened the folding doors of a room to the left, and having ushered me in, closed them behind me. I found myself in a salon, with a very well painted, highly varnished floor, chairs and sofas covered with white draperies, a green porcelain stove, walls hung with pictures in gilt frames, a gilt pendule and other ornaments on the mantelpiece, a large lustre pendant from the centre of the ceiling, mirrors, consoles, muslin curtains, and a handsome centre table completed the inventory of furniture. All looked extremely clean and glittering, but the general effect would have been somewhat chilling, had not a second large pair of folding doors, standing wide open and disclosing another and smaller salon, more snugly furnished, offered some relief to the eye. This room was carpeted, and therein was a piano, a couch, a chiffonier. Above all, it contained a lofty window and a crimson curtain, which, being undrawn, afforded another glimpse of the garden through the large clear panes, round which some leaves of ivy, some tendrils of vine were trained. "Monsieur Crimsworth, n'est-ce pas?" said a voice behind me, and starting involuntarily, I turned. I had been so taken up with the contemplation of the pretty little salon that I had not noticed the entrance of a person into the larger room. It was, however, Mademoiselle Reuter who now addressed me, and stood close beside me, and when I had bowed with instantaneously recovered sang-froid, for I am not easily embarrassed, I commenced the conversation by remarking on the pleasant aspect of her little cabinet, and the advantage she had over Monsieur Pelet in possessing a garden. Yes, she said, she often thought so, and added, "It is my garden, monsieur, which makes me retain this house. Otherwise I would probably have removed to larger and more commodious premises long since. But you see, I could not take my garden with me, and I should scarcely find one so large and pleasant anywhere else in town." I approved her judgment. "But you have not seen it yet," said she, rising. "Come to the window and take a better view." I followed her. She opened the sash, and leaning out I saw in full the enclosed domain which had hitherto been to me an unknown region. It was a long, not very broad strip of cultured ground, with an alley bordered by enormous old fruit trees down the middle. There was a sort of lawn, a parterre of rose trees, some flower borders, and on the far side a thickly planted copse of lilacs, laburnums, and acacias. It looked pleasant to me, very pleasant. So long a time had elapsed since I had seen a garden of any sort. But it was not only on Mademoiselle Reuter's garden that my eyes dwelt. When I had taken a view of her well-trimmed beds and budding shrubberies, I allowed my glance to come back to herself, nor did I hastily withdraw it. I had thought to see a tall, meagre, yellow, conventual image in black, with a close white cap, bandaged under the chin like a nun's headgear, whereas there stood by me a little and roundly formed woman, who might indeed be older than I, but was still young. She could not, I thought, be more than 6 or 7 and 20. She was as fair as a fair Englishwoman. She had no cap, her hair was nut brown, and she wore it in curls. Pretty her features were not, nor very soft, nor very regular, but neither were they in any degree plain, and I already saw cause to deem them expressive. What was their predominant cast? Was it sagacity, sense? Yes, I thought so, but I could scarcely as yet be sure. I discovered, however, that there was a certain serenity of eye and freshness of complexion most pleasing to behold. The colour on her cheek was like the bloom on a good apple, which is as sound at the core as it is red on the rind. Mademoiselle Reuter and I entered upon business. She said she was not absolutely certain of the wisdom of the step she was about to take, because I was so young, and parents might possibly object to a professor like me for their daughters. "But it is often well to act on one's own judgment," said she, "and to lead parents rather than be led by them. The fitness of a professor is not a matter of age, and from what I have heard, and from what I observe myself, I would much rather trust you than Monsieur Ledru, the music master, who is a married man of near 50. I remarked that I hoped she would find me worthy of her good opinion, that if I knew myself, I was incapable of betraying any confidence reposed in me. "Du reste," said she, "the surveillance will be strictly attended to." And then she proceeded to discuss the subject of terms. She was very cautious, quite on her guard. She did not absolutely bargain, but she warily sounded me to find out what my expectations might be, and when she could not get me to name a sum, she reasoned, and reasoned with a fluent yet quiet circumlocution of speech, and at last nailed me down to 500 francs per annum. Not too much, but I agreed. Before the negotiation was completed, it began to grow a little dusk. I did not hasten it, for I liked well enough to sit and hear her talk. I was amused with the sort of business talent she displayed. Edward could not have shown himself more practical, though he might have evinced more coarseness and urgency, and then she had so many reasons, so many explanations, and after all she succeeded in proving herself quite disinterested and even liberal. At last she concluded she could say no more, because, as I acquiesced in all things, there was no further ground for the exercise of her parts of speech. I was obliged to rise. I would rather have sat a little longer. What had I to return to but my small empty room? And my eyes had a pleasure in looking at Mademoiselle Reuter, especially now, when the twilight softened her features a little, and in the doubtful dusk I could fancy her forehead as open as it was really elevated, her mouth touched with turns of sweetness as well as defined in lines of sense. When I rose to go, I held out my hand, on purpose, though I knew it was contrary to the etiquette of foreign habits. She smiled, and said, "Ah, c'est comme tous les Anglais," but gave me her hand very kindly. "It is the privilege of my country, mademoiselle," said I, "and remember, I shall always claim it." She laughed a little, quite good-naturedly, and with the sort of tranquillity obvious in all she did, a tranquillity which soothed and suited me singularly. At least I thought so that evening. Brussels seemed a very pleasant place to me when I got out again into the street, and it appeared as if some cheerful, eventful, upward-tending career were even then opening to me, on that self-same mild, still April night. So impressionable a being is man, or at least such a man as I was in those days. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Barony.
Chapter 10 of The Professor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 10. Next day the morning hours seemed to pass very slowly at Monsieur Pelet's. I wanted the afternoon to come, that I might go again to the neighbouring pensionnat, and give my first lesson within its pleasant precincts, for pleasant they appeared to me. At noon the hour of recreation arrived. At 1 o'clock we had lunch. This got on the time, and at last St. Gudule's deep bell, tolling slowly 2, marked the moment for which I had been waiting. At the foot of the narrow back stairs that descended from my room, I met Monsieur Pelet. "Comme vous avez l'air rayonnant," said he, "je ne vous ai jamais vu aussi gai. Que s'est-il donc passé?" "Apparemment que j'aime les changements," replied I. "Ah, je comprends, c'est cela. Soyez sage seulement, vous êtes bien jeune, trop jeune pour le rôle que vous allez jouer. Il faut prendre garde, savez-vous? Mais quel danger y a-t-il? Je n'en sais rien. Ne vous laissez pas aller à de vives impressions, voilà tout. I laughed. A sentiment of exquisite pleasure played over my nerves at the thought that vives impressions were likely to be created. It was the deadness, the sameness of life's daily ongoings that had hitherto been my bane. My blouse-clad élève in the boys' seminary never stirred in me any vives impressions, except it might be occasionally some of anger. I broke from Monsieur Pelet, and as I strode down the passage, he followed me with one of his laughs, a very French, rakish, mocking sound. Again I stood at the neighbouring door, and soon was readmitted into the cheerful passage with its clear dove-colour imitation marble walls. I followed the portress, and descending a step and making a turn, I found myself in a sort of corridor. A side door opened. Mademoiselle Reuter's little figure, as graceful as it was plump, appeared. I could now see her dress in full daylight. A neat, simple mousseline laine gown fitted her compact round shape to perfection. Delicate little collar and manchette of lace, trim Parisian brodequin showed her neck, wrists, and feet to complete advantage. But how grave was her face as she suddenly came upon me! Solicitude and business were in her eye. On her forehead she looked almost stern. Her bonjour, monsieur, was quite polite, but so orderly, so commonplace, it spread directly a cool, damp towel over my vives impressions. The servant turned back when her mistress appeared, and I walked slowly along the corridor, side by side with Mademoiselle Reuter. Monsieur will give a lesson in the first class today, said she. Dictation or reading will perhaps be the best thing to begin with, for those are the easiest forms of communicating instruction in a foreign language, and at the first a master naturally feels a little unsettled. She was quite right, as I had found from experience. It only remained for me to acquiesce. We proceeded now in silence. The corridor terminated in a hall, large, lofty, and square. A glass door on one side showed within a long, narrow refectory, with tables, an armoire, and 2 lamps. It was empty. Large glass doors in front opened on the playground and garden. A broad staircase ascended spirally on the opposite side. The remaining wall showed a pair of great folding doors, now closed, and admitting, doubtless, to the classes. Mademoiselle Reuter turned her eye laterally on me, to ascertain, probably, whether I was collected enough to be ushered into her sanctum sanctorum. I suppose she judged me to be in a tolerable state of self-government, for she opened the door, and I followed her through. A rustling sound of uprising greeted our entrance. Without looking to the right or left, I walked straight up the lane between 2 sets of benches and desks, and took possession of the empty chair and isolated desk raised on an estrade of 1 step high, so as to command 1 division, the other division being under the surveillance of a maitresse similarly elevated. At the back of the estrade, and attached to a movable partition dividing this schoolroom from another beyond, was a large tableau of wood painted black and varnished. A thick crayon of white chalk lay on my desk, for the convenience of elucidating any grammatical or verbal obscurity which might occur in my lessons by writing it upon the tableau. A wet sponge appeared beside the chalk to enable me to efface the marks when they had served the purpose intended. I carefully and deliberately made these observations before allowing myself to take 1 glance at the benches before me. Having handled the crayon, looked back at the tableau, fingered the sponge in order to ascertain that it was in a right state of moisture, I found myself cool enough to admit of looking calmly up and gazing deliberately round me. And first I observed that Mademoiselle Reuter had already glided away. She was nowhere visible. A maitresse or teacher, the one who occupied the corresponding estrade to my own, alone remained to keep guard over me. She was a little in the shade, and with my short sight I could only see that she was of a thin, bony figure and rather tallowy complexion, and that her attitude, as she sat, partook equally of listlessness and affectation. More obvious, more prominent, shone on by the full light of the large window, were the occupants of the benches just before me, of whom some were girls of 14, 15, 16, some young women from 18, as it appeared to me, up to 20. The most modest attire, the simplest fashion of wearing the hair were apparent in all, and good features, ruddy blooming complexions, large and brilliant eyes, forms full even to solidity, seemed to abound. I did not bear the first view like a stoic. I was dazzled, my eyes fell, and in a voice somewhat too low, I murmured, "Prenez vos cahiers de dictée, Mademoiselle." Not so had I bid the boys at Pelet's take their reading books. A rustle followed, and an opening of desks. Behind the lifted lids, which momentarily screened the heads bent down to search for exercise books, I heard tittering and whispers. "Eulalie, je suis prête à pâmer de rire," observed one. "Comme il a rougi en parlant. Oui, c'est un véritable blanc-bec." "Tais-toi, Hortense, il nous écoute." And now the lids sank and the heads reappeared. I had marked 3, the whisperers, and I did not scruple to take a very steady look at them as they emerged from their temporary eclipse. It is astonishing what ease and courage their little phrases of flippancy had given me. The idea by which I had been awed was that the youthful beings before me, with their dark nun-like robes and softly braided hair, were a kind of half-angels. The light titter, the giddy whisper, had already in some measure relieved my mind of that fond and oppressive fancy. The 3 I allude to were just in front, within half a yard of my estrade, and were among the most womanly looking present. Their names I knew afterwards, and may as well mention now. They were Eulalie, Hortense, Caroline. Eulalie was tall and very finely shaped. She was fair, and her features were those of a Low Country Madonna. Many a figure de vierge have I seen in Dutch pictures exactly resembling hers. There were no angles in her shape or in her face, all was curve and roundness. Neither thought, sentiment, nor passion disturbed by line or flush the equality of her pale, clear skin. Her noble bust heaved with her regular breathing. Her eyes moved a little. By these evidences of life alone could I have distinguished her from some large handsome figure moulded in wax. Hortense was of middle size and stout. Her form was ungraceful, her face striking, more alive and brilliant than Eulalie's. Her hair was dark brown, her complexion richly coloured. There were frolic and mischief in her eye. Consistency and good sense she might possess, but none of her features betokened those qualities. Caroline was little, though evidently full grown. Raven black hair, very dark eyes, absolutely regular features, with a colourless olive complexion, clear as to the face and sallow about the neck, formed in her that assemblage of points whose union many persons regard as the perfection of beauty. How, with the tintless pallor of her skin and the classic straightness of her lineaments, she managed to look sensual, I don't know. I think her lips and eyes contrived the affair between them, and the result left no uncertainty on the beholder's mind. She was sensual now, and in 10 years' time she would be coarse. Promise plain was written in her face of much future folly. If I looked at these girls with little scruple, they looked at me with still less. Eulalie raised her unmoved eye to mine, and seemed to expect, passively but securely, an impromptu tribute to her majestic charms. Hortense regarded me boldly, and giggled at the same time, while she said, with an air of impudent freedom, "Dictez-nous quelque chose de facile pour commencer, monsieur." Caroline shook her loose ringlets of abundant but somewhat coarse hair over her rolling black eyes. Parting her lips, as full as those of a hot-blooded maroon, she showed her well-set teeth sparkling between them, and treated me at the same time to a smile de sa façon. Beautiful as Pauline Borghese, she looked at the moment scarcely purer than Lucrece de Borgia. Caroline was of noble family. I heard her lady mother's character afterwards, and then I ceased to wonder at the precocious accomplishments of the daughter. These three I at once saw deemed themselves the queens of the school, and conceived that by their splendour they threw all the rest into the shade. In less than 5 minutes they had thus revealed to me their characters, and in less than 5 minutes I had buckled on a breastplate of steely indifference, and let down a visor of impassible austerity. "Take your pens and commence writing," said I, in as dry and trite a voice as if I had been addressing only Jules van der Kelkhoff and Co. The dictée now commenced. My 3 bells interrupted me perpetually with little silly questions and uncalled-for remarks, to some of which I made no answer, and to others replied very quietly and briefly. "Comment dit-on point et virgule en anglais, monsieur?" "Semicolon, mademoiselle." "Semicolon. Ah, comme c'est drôle!" Giggle. "J'ai une si mauvaise plume, impossible d'écrire." "Mais, monsieur, je ne sais pas suivre, vous allez si vite." "Je n'ai rien compris, moi." Here a general murmur arose, and the teacher, opening her lips for the first time, ejaculated, "Silence, mesdemoiselles!" No silence followed; on the contrary, the 3 ladies in front began to talk more loudly. "C'est si difficile, l'anglais. Je déteste la dictée. Quel ennui d'écrire quelque chose que l'on ne comprend pas." Some of those behind laughed. A degree of confusion began to pervade the class. It was necessary to take prompt measures. "Donnez-moi votre cahier," said I to Eulalie in an abrupt tone, and bending over I took it before she had time to give it. "Et vous, mademoiselle, donnez-moi le vôtre," continued I more mildly, addressing a little pale, plain-looking girl who sat in the first row of the other division, and whom I had remarked as being at once the ugliest and the most attentive in the room. She rose up, walked over to me, and delivered her book with a grave, modest curtsy. I glanced over the 2 dictations. Eulalie's was slurred, blotted, and full of silly mistakes. Sylvie's, such was the name of the ugly little girl, was clearly written, it contained no error against sense, and but few faults of orthography. I coolly read aloud both exercises, marking the faults. Then I looked at Eulalie. "C'est honteux," said I, and I deliberately tore her dictation in 4 parts, and presented her with the fragments. I returned Sylvie her book with a smile, saying, "C'est bien, je suis content de vous." Sylvie looked calmly pleased. Eulalie swelled like an incensed turkey, but the mutiny was quelled. The conceited coquetry and futile flirtation of the first bench were exchanged for a taciturn sullenness, much more convenient to me, and the rest of the lesson passed without interruption. A bell clanging out in the yard announced the moment for the cessation of school labours. I heard our own bell at the same time, and that of a certain public college immediately afterwards. Order dissolved instantly. Up started every pupil. I hastened to seize my hat, bow to the maîtresse, and quit the room before the tide of externats should pour from the inner class, where I knew near 100 were prisoned, and whose rising tumult I already heard. I had scarcely crossed the hall and gained the corridor, when Mademoiselle Reuter came again upon me. "Step in here a moment," said she, and she held open the door of the side room, from whence she had issued on my arrival. It was a salle à manger, as appeared from the buffet and the armoire vitrée, filled with glass and china, which formed part of its furniture. Ere she had closed the door on me and herself, the corridor was already filled with day pupils, tearing down their cloaks, bonnets, and cabas from the wooden pegs on which they were suspended. The shrill voice of a maitresse was heard at intervals, vainly endeavouring to enforce some sort of order. Vainly, I say. Discipline there was none in these rough ranks, and yet this was considered one of the best conducted schools in Brussels. "Well, you have given your first lesson," began Mademoiselle Reuter in the most calm, equable voice, as though quite unconscious of the chaos from which we were separated only by a single wall. "Were you satisfied with your pupils, or did any circumstance in their conduct give you cause for complaint? Conceal nothing from me. Repose in me entire confidence." Happily, I felt in myself complete power to manage my pupils without aid. The enchantment, the golden haze which had dazzled my perspicuity at first, had been a good deal dissipated. I cannot say I was chagrined or downcast by the contrast which the reality of a pensionnat de demoiselles presented to my vague ideal of the same community. I was only enlightened and amused. Consequently, I felt in no disposition to complain to Mademoiselle Reuter, and I received her considerate invitation to confidence with a smile. "A thousand thanks, mademoiselle, all has gone very smoothly." She looked more than doubtful. "Et les trois demoiselles du premier ban?" said she. "Ah, tout va au mieux," was my answer, and Mademoiselle Reuter ceased to question me, but her eye, not large, not brilliant, not melting or kindling, but astute, penetrating, practical, showed she was even with me. It let out a momentary gleam, which said plainly, "Be as close as you like, I am not dependent on your candour. What you would conceal, I already know." By a transition so quiet as to be scarcely perceptible, the directress's manner changed, the anxious business air passed from her face, and she began chatting about the weather and the town, and asking in neighbourly wise after Monsieur and Madame Pelet. I answered all her little questions. She prolonged her talk, I went on following its many little windings. She sat so long, said so much, varied so often the topics of discourse, that it was not difficult to perceive she had a particular aim in thus detaining me. Her mere words could have afforded no clue to this aim, but her countenance aided. While her lips uttered only affable commonplaces, her eyes reverted continually to my face. Her glances were not given in full, but out of the corners, so quietly, so stealthily, yet I think I lost not one. I watched her as keenly as she watched me. I perceived soon that she was feeling after my real character. She was searching for salient points, weak points and eccentric points. She was applying now this test, now that, hoping in the end to find some chink, some niche, where she could put in her little firm foot and stand upon my neck, mistress of my nature. Do not mistake me, reader, it was no amorous influence she wished to gain; at that time it was only the power of the politician to which she aspired. I was now installed as a professor in her establishment, and she wanted to know where her mind was superior to mine, by what feeling or opinion she could lead me. I enjoyed the game much, and did not hasten its conclusion. Sometimes I gave her hopes, beginning a sentence rather weakly, when her shrewd eye would light up, she thought she had me. Having led her a little way, I delighted to turn round and finish with sound hard sense, whereat her countenance would fall. At last a servant entered to announce dinner. The conflict being thus necessarily terminated, we parted without having gained any advantage on either side. Mademoiselle Reuter had not even given me an opportunity of attacking her with feeling, and I had managed to baffle her little schemes of craft. It was a regular drawn battle. I again held out my hand when I left the room. She gave me hers. It was a small and white hand, but how cool! I met her eye, too, in full, obliging her to give me a straightforward look. This last test went against me. It left her as it found her, moderate, temperate, tranquil. Me it disappointed. I am growing wiser, thought I, as I walked back to Monsieur Pelet's. Look at this little woman. Is she like the women of novelists and romancers? To read of female character as depicted in poetry and fiction, one would think it was made up of sentiment, either for good or bad. Here is a specimen, and a most sensible and respectable specimen too, whose staple ingredient is abstract reason. No Talleyrand was ever more passionless than Zoraide Reuter. So I thought then. I found afterwards that blunt susceptibilities are very consistent with strong propensities. End of chapter 10. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.